The village of Green Hollow was as picturesque as they come. Endless fields of golden wheat stretched out under a sky so blue it seemed infinite. The air was heavy with the scent of soil and fresh hay, and life moved at a pace dictated by the rising and setting sun. But beneath its pastoral charm, Green Hollow carried a dark secret, a shadow that emerged every harvest season. The elders spoke of it only in whispers, their eyes darting to the windows and doorways as if afraid something might be listening. It always started the same way. A child would fail to come home for supper, or a farmer wouldn't return from the fields. Search parties would form, lanterns flickering in the darkness as the villagers called out names into the suffocating silence. Occasionally, they'd find a shoe, a scrap of fabric, or a tool lying abandoned, but never the person. The disappearances were always dismissed as tragic accidents or unfortunate encounters with wild animals. That was the story the mayor, the church, and the schoolteacher would repeat. But behind closed doors, people spoke of something else: the harvesters. Legend had it that the harvesters were not of this world. They came from the skies, cloaked in human form to blend in. They'd observe, waiting for the harvest season to begin. Then, amidst the hustle and bustle of the villagers reaping the fields, they would strike. No one knew why they took people. Some said it was for experiments, others whispered of a more sinister purpose. But one thing was clear: the harvest wasn't just about crops, it was about lives. For the Whitlock family, the rumors had always felt distant, like stories meant to frighten disobedient children. Samuel and his wife, Eleanor, had lived in Green Hollow their entire lives. They had a 10-year-old son, Thomas, who spent his days chasing grasshoppers and helping his father in the fields. To the Whitlocks, the idea of extraterrestrial beings prowling among the villagers seemed absurd. But that belief would soon be shattered. It was late September when the first disappearance of the season occurred. Mary Harker, a young woman known for her fiery red hair and infectious laughter, didn't return from her afternoon walk. Her mother's screams pierced the night, and the villagers gathered with torches and pitchforks, searching the woods and fields. They found nothing but Mary's scarf, snagged on a branch near the edge of the forest. The mood in Green Hollow shifted. People locked their doors earlier, and even the bravest men refused to wander alone after dark. The whispers about the harvesters grew louder, no longer confined to the elderly. One evening, Samuel and Eleanor sat by the fireplace, the warm glow casting long shadows on the wooden walls of their modest home. Thomas sat on the floor, sketching a crude drawing of a scarecrow in a field. "Do you think the harvesters are real?" he asked, his voice light but tinged with curiosity. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Samuel. "It's just a story, darling," she said, forcing a smile. "Something people made up to explain things they don't understand." "But why do people disappear?" Thomas pressed, his pencil pausing mid-stroke. Samuel cleared his throat. "There's always a reason, son. Maybe Mary got lost or—" His voice trailed off, unconvincing even to himself. "We just need to be careful. Stay close to home and never go anywhere alone." Thomas nodded solemnly, but that night, as the family slept, an unease settled over the house like a heavy fog. Outside, the fields swayed in the wind, whispering secrets only they could understand. Somewhere in the distance, a faint hum reverberated through the air, a sound so low it was almost imperceptible. It was a crisp morning when Thomas vanished. Samuel had risen before dawn, as he always did during harvest season, and headed to the fields. Eleanor stayed behind to prepare breakfast, calling Thomas to help her set the table. But he didn't answer. Assuming he was still asleep, she climbed the narrow staircase to his room, only to find his bed empty. Panic clawed at her chest. "Samuel!" she screamed, running outside. Her husband came rushing from the fields, his face pale as he took in her frantic words. They searched the house, the barn, and the surrounding fields, shouting Thomas's name until their throats were raw. By midday, half the village had joined the search. Eleanor clutched her son's favorite toy, a wooden horse, as tears streamed down her face. Samuel's hands trembled, his mind racing with fear and guilt. It was near the edge of the forest where they found the first clue: Thomas's shoe, lying in the dirt. The villagers stopped, their collective breath held as if the very air had thickened. An old woman muttered a prayer under her breath, and a young man crossed himself. Samuel picked up the shoe, his knuckles white. "Thomas!" he shouted into the trees. The only response was the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a crow. That night, the Whitlock home was silent except for Eleanor's quiet sobs. Samuel sat at the table, staring at the shoe as if it might offer answers. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Outside, the fields were eerily still, the wind having vanished along with the sunlight. And then he heard it again, the faint hum, growing louder, closer. Samuel stepped outside, his heart pounding. The air felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. He saw nothing unusual, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Returning inside, he bolted the door and sat by the window, a shotgun resting across his lap. Sleep would not come. The days turned into weeks, and Thomas's disappearance became the latest in Green Hollow's long, tragic history. The villagers offered their condolences, but their fear was palpable. No one lingered to chat, and even the closest friends of the Whitlocks avoided their home as if their grief was contagious. Samuel couldn't let it go. He began spending his nights in the fields, watching, waiting. He'd seen strange lights in the sky, brief flashes that danced above the horizon before vanishing. Once he'd stumbled upon a patch of flattened wheat, the stalks bent in perfect circles. It made no sense, but neither did the disappearances. One night, as he sat in the fields with his shotgun and lantern, Samuel heard a rustling behind him. He turned, his breath catching in his throat. Standing just beyond the lantern's glow was a figure, tall, gaunt, and unervingly still. "Who's there?" Samuel demanded, raising his weapon. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth. For a moment, it looked human. But as it entered the light, Samuel saw its face, pale and featureless, with eyes that glowed faintly like embers. Samuel fired, but the figure moved impossibly fast, disappearing into the darkness. He ran back to the house, locking every door and window. Eleanor met him at the door, her face pale. "What happened?" she whispered. "They're real," Samuel said, his voice shaking. "The harvesters. They took Thomas, and they're still here." Determined to find his son, Samuel began investigating the disappearances more closely. He spoke to the elders, who reluctantly shared their stories. One man claimed to have seen a star fall from the sky the night his brother disappeared. Another described strange markings on the ground near where her husband had vanished. Samuel's obsession consumed him. He stopped tending the fields, leaving Eleanor to manage the harvest. She pleaded with him to stop, but he couldn't. One night, he found himself drawn to the forest where Thomas's shoe had been found. With a lantern in one hand and his shotgun in the other, he ventured into the woods. The deeper he went, the stranger the surroundings became. The trees seemed to bend unnaturally, their branches forming twisted arches. The hum he'd heard before was louder now, almost deafening. And then he saw it, a clearing bathed in an eerie, otherworldly light. At the center stood a structure, a metallic dome that pulsed with energy. Samuel approached cautiously, his heart pounding. As he neared the dome, he saw figures moving inside. They were tall and slender, their pale faces glowing faintly. And then he saw Thomas, standing among them, his eyes vacant. Samuel called out to his son, but Thomas didn't respond. The figures turned, their glowing eyes fixed on Samuel. He raised his shotgun, but before he could fire, a wave of energy knocked him to the ground. His vision blurred, and he felt himself being dragged toward the dome. Inside, the air was thick and metallic, and strange symbols glowed on the walls. Samuel struggled, but the being's grip was unyielding. They spoke in a language he couldn't understand, their voices resonating in his mind rather than his ears. He saw other villagers there, their faces blank and lifeless, as if their very essence had been drained. Summoning every ounce of strength, Samuel broke free and grabbed Thomas, shaking him. "Wake up, son. It's me." For a moment, Thomas's eyes flickered with recognition, and he whispered, "Daddy." The beings advanced, their movements deliberate and unrelenting. Samuel knew he had only one chance. He grabbed a piece of glowing equipment and smashed it against the wall. The dome shuddered, and the beings let out an inhuman screech. Grabbing Thomas, Samuel ran. The dome erupted in light as they reached the edge of the clearing. Samuel shielded Thomas with his body as a deafening roar filled the air. When he looked back, the dome and the beings were gone, leaving only a scorched patch of earth. Samuel and Thomas stumbled back to the village, exhausted but alive. The other villagers didn't believe their story, attributing the burns and bruises to an accident. But Samuel and Eleanor knew the truth. The harvesters might be gone for now, but the scars they left, on the land and in their hearts, would remain forever. And every harvest season, as the field swayed in the wind, Samuel couldn't help but wonder if the hum would return.